Ryan, and I'm going to talk to you guys about rigging a kayak. Before we get into that, most people, the biggest question they ask is, what kayak will I get? I recommend trying multiple kayaks. Go to one of these kayak dealers demo days and try everything they'll let you out on. And then go to another kayak dealer and do the same thing. They're not going to be mad at you. I've got 3 or 4 different kayaks. You can come out with me. Mine don't have an extra one anymore.
I'm sorry?
You don't have an extra kayak anymore.
No, I actually just sold mine 2 days ago.
But if you wanted to try one out, I'm sure Mike could put you out there and let you paddle his around, check it out. I take people out all the time. It's fun for me just teaching people how to do this stuff. The next thing I'd like to talk about is rigging the kayak. And every kayak's going to be different, but Mike likes the plastic rod holders. I broke 2 of them. I lost 2 rods. I've tried the track mounts. I've lost a rod in them. I got back. Anything metal, bolted, solid. And if you have to, go under the rail, go under the gunnel, and put a piece of aluminum in there and bolt your rod holders to that. I mean, you've got a $300-400 setup. You don't want something screwed to a piece of plastic and it depended on that.
And one thing on that too, something you have to realize in the kayak world, unfortunately, they are not building kayaks for us yet. They are focusing every kayak for bass fishermen at this point in time. So you have to take that into account. Bass are tiny fish. Why would they have all this heavy duty stuff for a kayak when the majority of kayak fishermen in the country right now are bass fishermen, not kayak cat fishermen? We're working our way up. Our numbers are growing and getting exponentially bigger every single year, but we're still the lower number fishermen on the grand scheme of things. So keep that in mind. Every kayak you ever buy, they're tailoring it towards bass. They're not tailoring it towards catfish. So you gotta keep that in mind when you're rigging all your stuff. So you have to add the extra stability and sturdiness to all your rigs because they're not making it for us yet. Hopefully they change that.
Everything you see on here is either from the boat world that I've modified. My rod holders, that's Steve's rod holders, monster rod holders. I think the bases are for a G3 rail mount on a boat. I mean, you just have to find stuff, and if anybody needs help with anything, if you're trying to rig one out, you always reach out to me or Mike. We'll do everything we can to help you. But you can see, I mean, that you would turn my kayak over before you did anything with that rod. That's the main part to all of it. You can't catch a fish if your rod holder can't hold the fish.
And what he just did right there doesn't do the kayak enough justice. One of the big highs that we get in the kayak world, a fish hits that rod like that, your entire vessel is going to be leaning over with that rod. He locks his down really hard, so he gets an even bigger rock than I do. I like having a little give, a little drag, but my experience so far has been I've lost fish if my drag's been too tight. He doesn't have that experience, so he locks his down. A big draw to kayak catfishing is that, it's the primalness. It's you versus the fish. There's very little between you and that fish. It's very primal. You see he has a net. When I'm competition catfishing, I use a net. But when I'm out of competition, there's nothing like pulling a 40-pound fish in from the water that you are right next to into a vessel, and that whole vessel kind of wobbles and stuff. Now, somebody might think, hell, that's too unsafe. It's not for me. There are 450-pound dudes who stand in these kayaks and bass fish. They're constantly casting all day long. These are more than likely, you're going to fall out of one of these today before you flip it. Like, don't get me wrong. If you go on a kayak, you're going to fall out at one point in time. We all do. We all make dumb mistakes. But these kayaks are made today to be sturdy, to be stable. A lot of people get really nervous. Like, I'm a big dude. I'm 6 foot. I'm this, I'm that. Try it out. Go to a dealership. Jackson, Hobie, Old Town. Those would be the 3 that I would suggest. I'm a Jackson rep, so I guess I should be pushing you to Jackson. But I would rather see somebody get into the world of kayak catfishing first, because not all boats are made the same. There's going to be like 4 Jackson kayaks that are completely different than this. There'll be 4 Hobies completely different than this. Then there'll be 4 Old Towns completely different. So you got to find what works for you. But yeah, back to the primalness of pulling a fish out of the water. That's something, for me, might weigh half my weight. So, there's nothing that compares to fighting these giant fish in these little vessels.
I have a boat. I have an 18-foot boat. The only time my boat goes out is if I'm taking the wife, the kids, somebody that don't fish wants to go, I take them out on the boat. Catching a 50-pound, 60-pound fish from a boat is nothing like doing it from a kayak. You're completely at the fish's mercy. If the fish wants to go left, you're going left. You're not going to stop it. It's a downfall in a way. If that fish runs toward a brush pile and you're in a boat, you can use the backbone in your rods and crank down on him and pull him out of that. If he runs toward a brush pile on his kayak, you're going with him to that brush pile.
Speaking of that too, so you'll see my setup back there and his setup. We have all these fancy electronics and trolling motors and stuff. I don't want anyone to look at our rigs and think you have to have this to do what we do. I paddled only for over a year. I was strictly paddle. The only reason I have all this, it's my hobby, it's what I do, I love it, and it came over time. I don't want, sometimes people see all this stuff and they're like, oh man, why would I spend all this money when I could just get a boat? Well, start off with a smaller kayak and a paddle. And then once you get that first, when you are paddling at 0.3, 0.4, and then all of a sudden the trees are going that direction and you're still paddling, but it's because the fish is pulling you that direction, it is so much fun. There's no thrill like that. So don't think you have to buy all this like high-end quality, motors, etc. Buy a cheap kayak, a cheaper kayak, a smaller kayak, go out in the back creek, that's what I did. Once you catch that first 20-pound fish, you're gonna be hooked. And if you don't do it full-time, you'll at least do it part-time. It's so much fun, so much fun.
I won my first kayak catfish tournament. The actual first time I ever targeted catfish. I went out on a $300 Walmart lifetime timberette kayak with 2 bass rods. I didn't even have rod holders. I had the rods tucked up under my legs in the kayak. I mean, it doesn't take expensive gear. When you get out like we are, and we do this religiously, probably more than we should, this just makes everything easier and more comfortable. And that allows us to be on the water longer for more periods of time. You start running these month-long tournaments, and if you ain't on the water 40 hours a week, you're not placing in the money. I mean, it's just, if you don't do it, somebody else will. And that's just what it takes to stay competitive. And if I can stay comfortable, I'm going to do that. So,
before we go to type of fishing, do we want to take questions on rigging, how to, where?
Yeah.
Something. Does anybody have a question on something they maybe don't see that they think we should have, or they see that we have up here and they're just curious how it got rigged that way? Start with Adam. Well, I'll walk over to you. I'll say the question out loud. So what was the question, sir? The black rod. Oh, the black rod on the chair. That is his light.
That is a convex light. You can order that through Uncle Lou's Tackle on Facebook. I think they're like 80, 90 bucks. It's remote controlled. I can turn it on, off, dim it, change the color of the light. It keeps the mosquitoes and the bugs way away from me. The only downfall of that light is when you're night fishing, that light I can see probably from here to the other side of that screen away from me like it's daytime. So you can see that perfect. Anything beyond that, you can't see anywhere. So dragging and drifting, you can't see the treetops. You can't tell where you're at on the lake, and I rely all on my electronics for that at that point. Another upside, a big boat coming down the lake wide open with no lights on will see you in the middle of the lake versus if you're out there with a couple of little Navy lights or something like that. It's about being seen. That's why my shirt's this color. You get pleasure boaters in the summertime and they don't know what they're doing. It gets dangerous. So,
any more questions on the rigging or how-tos? Nope. All right, do you want to go to styles of fishing that we do in the kayak?
Yeah, so my main style is dragging and suspend fishing, which is why I have so many different rod holders and so many styles. So normally these front rods are set up to suspend fish, and I've got them straight out the sides in the, I call it 0 degree, I guess it's 90. That's for suspend fishing. I'm usually in shallow water, 3, 4, 5 foot of water. That's about average of what I fish. Then at the same time, I'll be pulling planer boards out the back. So I like to pull these 2 straight below me and put out 2 planer boards. In our national tournament series, you can only run 4 rods. So I'll put 2 on planer boards and get them out. I'm still covering the same water, but I'm dragging with a Santee drifter and a peg float behind me on the planer boards. So I'm covering a 30, 40-foot wide swath of water through a mud flat. And normally I'll work that entire mud flat. I'll work up one side, back down the middle, and back up the other side. Sometimes I will pull, if these rods are getting hit that are dragging baits and these ain't getting touched, I'll put out 4 boards out the back. I won't go more than that. You hook a 50-pound fish on a kayak and you've got 4 boards out, you're tying 4 rigs on. Because that fish will run from one to the other and there is nothing you can do about it. That's another danger actually, because you've got these rods up like this. That fish turns you and puts slack in your line. You now got, I'm running 50-pound braid and 50-pound mono. That gets wrapped around you and you go in the water, you better have a life jacket on because you're not swimming with braid wrapped around you 2 or 3 times. So that turns into another safety issue. That's part of the reason I won't go with more than that. That's about it. I mean, sometimes I'll pull boards in the thermocline. I fish a thermocline lake. People hate it. Steve Douglas says it's the hardest lake to fish he's ever seen. I love it. That's where I learned how to fish. But I'll basically have this rig with no peg float, and I'll drop it down to wherever the thermocline, I find it on my fish finder. Wherever that's at, I'll go about 1 foot, 6 inches above it, and I'll put out 4 planer boards at that depth. And I'll just drag those boards right down the lake aimlessly, basically, because fish then are not relating to structure, they're relating to bait most of the time. So if you find bait, pull your baits under them just above that thermocline. That's the coolest water you can get and the most easy food you can get. I always say catfish are fat, lazy creatures. They're going to be as easy as they can about everything. So I'll pull the boards through the thermocline. That's some of the most violent takedowns I've ever had. You take a 30-pound fish in a thermocline, and for some reason when he hits, he will just drag the entire kayak around backwards. I'm usually asleep half the time on here. And that's part of the excitement of catfishing for me. You go from 0 to 100 in just a minute. I mean, 0, you'll be asleep on the kayak, ain't had a bite in 2 hours, and you'll have 2 planer boards go off at the same time with 30, 40-pound fish, and then I call it controlled chaos, is what I call it. That's the biggest thrill you ever find in your life.
And then I'll branch over to my rigs. So my rigs are a little more lucrative than his. His are simple. He has his lake down packed. I often travel to brand new waters. I'm trying to do the YouTube thing, and I fish once a week. So I can't go to these. Get away from me. I can't go to these new waters and just have 1 hook out or 2 rods, etc. Especially in Ohio. Inland, you're only allowed 2 rods. It's really frustrating. So I'm fishing these national events against these guys with unlimited rods, and I have to fish with 2. So some ways I get around that is I rarely ever don't have a double hook rig on. So when I'm fishing the Ohio River and I'm suspend drifting, and this trick can actually be pulled over to the boat world too. I've been using this on my buddies' boats too and having a lot of success. So it's just your normal, I call it the Kayak Lake Rig 2.0, but it's just a Kentucky rig. You got your dropper knot down here, you got another dropper knot with your 2 hooks. And I started running a dragging weight instead of a lead weight because as you can see in this kayak, you got 2 rods behind you. We want the widest spread possible, so we are always going to have rods out of our sight. If I'm looking right, I don't see these 2. If I'm looking left, I can't see these 2. And if I'm facing forward, I can't see these 2. When I used to run lead weights, the only time you know you're hung is you're going down the river, half the river current, and you see your line coming up in front of you, and you're like, oh, great. And you go to lift it up, and by that time, the lead weight's completely hung. With these, when you're running a dragging weight on the bottom, I look over and I see my line coming up, I just lift the rod up and down, and the dragging weight never gets hung. So I have increased my fishing time by hours every time I go suspend fishing, because if you go from a 40-foot flat to like a 35-foot ledge all of a sudden, in a kayak, all 4 of your rods are hung. I mean, I've seen rods and boats snap do that, but like you can walk over to every rod and reel them up really quick. Not in a kayak. In a kayak, you gotta like dedicate all your time and focus to 1 rod, because if you try and reel down on these, the rod's gonna spin. You don't have the option of using multiple hands and multiple rods. So that's why this is what I use when I suspend drift. I like using this in current 2 mile an hour and under. The goal is to get half the current speed. So if the current's 2, I try and suspend drift at 1. The theory there is the scent gets to the fish before your bait gets to the fish. Another beautiful thing about using the double hook rig here, mine's really spread out. This is something I would use in warmer water temps. Some days, this is the only hook that gets hit. They're settling at this water column. Some days, this is the only hook that gets hit. Now, if I was suspend drifting now with the water temps under 50 degrees, I would probably have the hooks closer, because we all know when their water temps are down, they're staging low. That's where the most consistent water is. If they're in a 50-foot hole right after a ledge, that's the most consistent temperature, that's the most consistent flow. So the majority of the time in the winter or colder weather, I'll be using this one. This is just a bumping rig. Some people don't think it's possible to bump in a kayak. It is more than possible. So I'm not going to go over this one quite extensively. It's a super short leader. A lot of times you'll see longer ones, but again, the last time I went fishing, it was cold. So it's really short. You got a crane swivel, I believe they're called. You always take your weight from where the main line's coming. And then I use a chain swivel right here. That prevents this from tying up. Now, there's a lot of great videos on how to bump, so I'm not going to go over that. But this is a pretty standard bumping rig. And there are a lot of guys who don't use the float. They'll just have no pay float and go on the bottom. I'm super lazy. I hate getting hung up and I hate retying. Also, in the kayak, if you don't have pre-rigs, everything in a kayak is like 5 times harder than doing it in a boat. In a boat, you walk over, grab your tackle box, you got all this room. In the kayak, you're leaning over, you're trying to grab a tackle box, now you're losing a hook through a scupper hole, and now you just lost the weight. So I do everything I can not to get hung up. And then the last rig I use, and I use this in super low current. Like if we somehow have a day on the Ohio River where it's not going over like 0.5, I'll drag the Ohio in 0.5 or under. But this is my double hook dragging rig. I love using this for channel cats. It's one of my favorite fish to fish for. Lighter, dragging weight up here. I mean, you can use whatever, depending on what you need it for. And I always go double hook rig. So in theory, I'm too short. Hold on. In theory, as the boat goes this direction, same thing. Some days, only this hook will get hit. Some days, only this hook will get hit. It's about providing as many options as possible. And again, some people are like, well, that seems like a lot of work. Imagine if you only can use 2 rods. I gotta be able to compete with those guys using 4 rods, 5 rods, 6 rods. I mean, I know some guys who run 8 rods. So I gotta have every opportunity possible to catch a fish. And you might ask me why I have all these beads and rattles. I actually don't believe rattles make any noise when you're just dragging, because it's just, if you think about it, it's not making any noise right now. It's not much different in the water, especially in a lake where there's no current. But my theory is when a fish comes up and hits this bait, that just made a noise. So now it's going to be easier for that fish, especially in muddy water, to come around and retarget it. They're fish, they're evolved to the point where they don't need it, but why not give them some extra help? Also, if they go and hit this bait like this, boom, every other fish around just heard that. So maybe they'll come up and come and check out what just happened. I can't tell you how many times I've been dragging baits, and it's little peck, little peck, little peck, little peck. And then out of nowhere, the rod just gets doubled over. My theory is the little fish were doing the feeding, and it attracted a bigger fish, like, all right, let me go check out what's going on. And he either ate the little fish, or he was like, oh, there's a free easy meal. I'm going to eat that meal that's right there that they couldn't get in their mouths. So that's why I have the rattles. These beads, when you're running a double hook rig, this leader line right here, after 4 or 5 fish, that leader line gets absolutely destroyed. So like after 4 or 5 fish, you really should be retying on a leader if you're using a double hook rig. I noticed if I start putting these beads here, this leader line might have been used for over 50 fish. I'm really lazy. I'm really bad at retying leader lines and putting new rigs on. This rig you're looking at easily could have caught 40 to 50 plus fish. And it still looks brand new. Like there's no issue. If you caught like 10 fish with this leader, this from here to here would be absolutely shredded. Also, those beads, if you're suspend drifting in really slow current, and again, this is also something that can be applied to the boat world, just not just the kayak world. If you're suspend drifting, I'm just going to take these off for an example. If you're suspend drifting and you got that hook here, what's that hook going to do? It's going to sit down. And if the current's slow, fish comes up to hit this, what's he also going to hit? He's going to hit this leader line. When he hits that leader line's going to pull the bait away from his face. Well, when you are suspend drifting with these beads connected, it forces this line to stay taut. So now, even if you're in slow to no current, you still have your hook away from your leader line. So when that fish comes up, you see how much easier it is for him to grab the bait and not hit your leader line? Whereas if it was sitting down here, if it came up, they're hitting not only your hook, they're also hitting the leader line, which can mess with the hook sets. I have had an astronomical better increase in hook sets since I started putting these beads on my rigs like this. Now, I don't use them, I know some people use them here. I haven't noticed a difference here, but in these Kentucky rigs where you're running double hooks, it has been a complete game changer for me in quantity and quality. Because those bigger fish with the bigger mouths, I just feel like they've been coming up and consuming the whole leader and unhooking themselves up to where the dropper knot is. Which brings me to my last point, dropper knot length. I like a real, since I started using the beads, before I started using the beads, if I used a long dropper knot, the leader would get destroyed, like I said, in a few fish. But once I started using the beads, I can now get away with using really long dropper knots. That gives the bigger fish even more opportunity to get up this leader line or up the hook and hit the bait without hitting the leader line. So I like a really long dropper knot when I'm doing my dropper knots. And those are essentially the three kinds of fishing that we do in the kayak. The last one, where is it? Or the last 2 points I'll make. This is just your everyday standard rig for when you're casting. We also like to cast fish from the kayak. When you're in spot lock, no matter how good your spot lock is, there's always going to be sway. So if I'm anchor fishing with spot lock, I'll use a sink or slide. If I'm precision anchoring, like this time of year, I'll be precision anchoring. I'll be dropping an anchor for as little sway as possible because I don't want my baits to move at all. I would have my weight clipped directly to the swivel. And somebody might ask, that's a lot of clip swivels. The reason I use these clip swivels, you'll notice every single rig I have, all my pre-ties are pre-tied to a clip swivel. When I'm suspend drifting, I got 4 rods out and they're all suspend drifting. If I want to change to dragging, I used to have to retie all my lines. Even if I did a pre-rigged leader, I still had to tie the knot. And if your hands are frozen in the winter or anything like that, tying knots with like 80-pound ray or 80-pound monos is really annoying. I pre-tie every single one of my leaders to a clip. I can change all four of my fishing rods from one style of fishing to another in less than a minute. Whereas before, it took me well over 10 minutes to get everything in, clip. And well, not only that, you got to snip it off. You got to snip off your other leader. Now you got to tie this one, and you got to snip off that leader line. Now I take my pre-ties and I just clip them on, and I went from suspend fishing to dragging in less than 30 seconds or a minute. It's so nice. It saves so much time. And when you're in a kayak, it's all about efficiency. You know, it might seem like a little redundant in a boat, but you're so open and so free. In a kayak, it's all about being efficient. And competition fishing, we do a lot of 8-hour and 24-hour events. You want your lines in the water as fast as humanly possible. That time out of the water could be the time someone else is catching the fish, who has a more efficient process.
And the reason I don't go with these double hook rig setups, if I go with them where I'm at, there's a lot of brush piles, stick ups and stuff, I stay hung up. They are a more effective way of catching fish, but if you're hung up and retying leaders or re-rigging rods, your rods ain't in the water anyway. So my thing is keep them simpler. The swivels that he uses, that's just more stuff I have to bring with me. So I keep it just as simple as I can. He's talking about your hands being cold, tying rigs. I carry the buddy heater. That thing is a lifesaver. We did a tournament last winter. I had 3 inches of snow on my kayak after it was over. Without that little heater, I wouldn't have made it. The way I beat Mike in that tournament, he didn't have his heater. He got out, came in 30 minutes or an hour early. That 30 minutes or an hour that he came in, I caught the winning fish. That little heater won me that tournament. So that little heater makes it, I can warm my hands up and tie knots. I mean, y'all have all tied knots and it's 0 degrees outside. It is not easy. It is not fun. Warm your hands up on the heater, take your gloves off, warm your hands up, tie your rigs, you're good. Something else I do, he uses the swivel so he can change his rigs out real fast from suspend fishing to dragging to his double hook rig. I carry more rods. Mike, when you see him on the water, he's usually got 4 rods with it. You see me on the water, this kayak's not even fully set up. I've got 4 more rod holders that go across the back with 4 more rods. I'll have 4 dragging rigs and 4 suspend fishing rigs tied up on my rods ready to go. If I decide to go from suspended to dragging, I reel it up, I put a piece of bait on another rod, I'm going again. We have completely different ways of fishing, and we are very competitive with each other in what we do. If we go to an in-person tournament, well, 80 to 90% of the time, it's me and you first and second. And it's probably 60% me winning and 40% him.
Yeah. One last thing I'm going to point on. I get this question a lot. Why do some of my rigs have this kind of dragging weight? Why do some of them have that kind of dragging weight? Well, that is because, let me take this off. So when these slinkier kind of dragging weights, when you have one of these, when they're dragging across the bottom, let me get somewhere where you all can see. These are dragging across the bottom. This is how they're dragging across the bottom. So the entire thing is touching almost the entire time. This is great for a mud bottom. They're fantastic for a mud bottom. It's also fantastic for when the fish are staging much lower because it naturally sits. It naturally sits much lower. However, I am not a huge fan of these when it's rockier surfaces or harder surfaces. That's why I use these ones. If this was longer, it'd be better so you guys can see. When this is dragging across the bottom, see how it's dragging? There's a lot more, it's only one point of contact on the bottom of the river. So the reason I use the longer, stiffer ones and rockier surfaces is because it's a less chance that it's going to get hung up. Whereas these ones that are, more slinky-like, when you're going over those rockier surfaces, the whole point of contact is the whole entire dragging weight. So there's a much more likelihood this will get hung up. That's why I use both.
And I deal with that same problem by using a bigger peg float with a bigger dragging weight. So if you use those are the 3-inch, I think they're 1-inch round. If you go up to the 3-inch round peg floats, it pulls more of that dragon sinker up off the bottom. Gives me the same effect as what he just did with the same dragon weight. So now I only have to carry half as many weights with me. I don't have to carry a whole nother type of dragon weight. I don't think I have any of the bigger peg floats on there. The only difference is you have to cut the leader line to put them on. That's the biggest difference.
Any questions on the rigging that we use, how we rig them, how we tie them, anything like that? Yeah.
The swivels you use, have you ever had them straighten out on fish?
So his question, good question. Have I ever had one of my swivels straighten out on fish? So even this T-swivel that I'm using, the weight is always at the bottom. So I'm assuming you say straighten out right here. I did on bad brands. Like if you go on Amazon, you can buy cheap brands. You can buy better brands from people you know, people here. I mean, Amazon has good brands too. But I stray away from using, I actually might have one still tied up because I'm that lazy.
I used to use them a lot, but they kept straightening out on them.
This is a really bad brand. I don't know if you guys can see it. And I don't know the name of the brand. It's a cheap one on Amazon. This one will straighten out right here. There's a little red bead. I forget the name of it. But yeah, he's completely correct. This T-swivel will straighten out. This one, I have not had straightened out yet. I have not had this brand straighten out. I couldn't tell you why. Maybe it has something to do with those beads and how the swivel's made. But I haven't had this one straighten out quite yet.
What's the biggest fish you caught on that?
My 2 PBs are in the 40s. So in the kayak, a lot of us don't carry scales. But we've been to enough tournaments. We know roughly what fish weigh. My biggest flathead's in the 40s and my biggest blue is in the 40s. And he's going to lie and say he has a 70 or something. But, nah, you don't got it. Nah. But yeah, it's in the 40s. It's in the 40s.
If I do use the quick clips at all, I don't know how good y'all are going to be able to see that. It's the ones that look like a really fat paper clip. To me, they're much stronger than those. I just feel like this is smaller, more compact. It's less likely to get hung up. And it feels, if you just feel of them, they feel a lot sturdier. I mean, I can see it bending and unclipping. This, there's no way it's going to once you get everything clipped together. It's the tensile strength of the steel is the weakest point in it.
I got these little hands though, and I'm weak, so that's why I don't use those. They can be a pain to unclip and get onto other metal surfaces. Great question, thank you for asking. Any more questions on the rigging or anything like that? Don't be shy.
So we can talk about tackle storage.
That's good.
This is all the catfish I carry. This is all the catfish gear I carry when I go to a tournament. Anywhere I go, this is all I carry. I've got lead weights down in the hole of my kayak that there's just no way to fit them in a box like this because you have to have so many different sizes. This has got peg floats, 2 different size hooks, 3-way swivels, these clips, and sinker slide clips. I don't use sinker slides. I clip directly to the swivel with the sinker. I feel like the sinker slides, if you're anchor fishing, I've been anchor fishing before in the boat, get a bit of sway in it with the peg float, and you look up and you'll see your peg float floating up on top of the water. So if you clip your sinker directly to the swivel on the end of your line there, there's no way that can come up off the bottom. When you cast that out, that's where it's staying. The drawback to that, if a fish hits that bait, he's got to drag that sinker ever how far to get the slack out of your line. The sinker don't weigh enough to set the hook. You may miss a fish because of that, but you're not going to miss a fish if your bait's floating up here on the surface of the water. I've never caught a catfish on top water. I don't know if y'all have or not, but I've never got one on the top water bait.
That's the one issue with the spot lock motors on a kayak. I don't know how bad the sway issues on boats. I've been on boats, it doesn't seem terrible. But the sway, because there's still not a kayak motor either. There are kayak trolling motors. It's just a regular motor with the shaft cut down, so it's easier to handle on a kayak. So our sway is huge. Like we'll have a 10-foot sway, both directions. And like he said, if you're on a sinker swivel or a swivel clip, you look behind you in like 25 foot of water and you see your foot at the top of the water. It's extremely frustrating. So I do the same thing. You'll see that a lot of my weights are connected directly to, my weight would be connected directly to the swivel, because no matter how much I sway, like even if I casted this rig, no matter how much I sway, I'm guaranteed to be this far off the bottom. Whereas if I had a sinker slide, every time I swayed, that much farther comes up. Every time you come back into position, that's how much farther your bait's going to be off the bottom. And that's a huge pain in the butt when it's cold, like it is now, and you're trying to precision anchor and get those fish that are mudding, or not mudding, burrowing in the mud. Tackle storage. Before I had a kayak that had internal storage, I had a kayak that had no internal storage. So I had a PFD, it looks like a fly fishing vest. I had all my gear on my person. So if I needed a weight, I would go in a pocket, I would have a weight. If I needed a hook, everything was connected to my person. I still do that today, just because it's more convenient. It's not dangerous to get into your front hatches, but why step onto the bow if you don't have to? Or, reach behind you if you don't have to. So anything I ever need, I can literally just grab right off my person and, unhook a fish, retie a leader, any of that kind of stuff.
That, the boat sway he was talking about there a second ago, it's horrible with the trolling motor, but what people don't notice, on a big boat, you've got choppy water on it, and you're on a big boat. So on a kayak, a 1-foot swell feels twice as big as it does on a big boat. So if you're on a big boat and it's rocking a little bit because of a 1-foot swell, you're on a kayak, you're moving up and down 1 foot. It don't lean and it rock and tilt like the big boat does. It goes straight up and down. If you're casted out, every time that kayak comes up, it drags your baits back to you. Well, then you got slack in your line again, which is the same as the boat sway he's talking about. I usually hard anchor. My trolling motor doesn't have spot lock. I'm usually hard anchored, and that it still affects me the same way. For some reason, the river current hits these kayaks, and it just makes them want to sway. Even with the rudder and stuff that I've got that's supposed to keep it straight, it still is an issue.
And speaking of the waves, a lot of questions we get, because I fish the Ohio River almost as my main fishery. People are like, oh, those barges are so big, that has to be so scary. Believe it or not, the worst weights to get in a kayak are jet ski weights and john boat weights. So when you're in a kayak, you're essentially one with the water as far as the water coming through. So if a big wake comes by, your kayak just goes over. You don't tilt at all. You just go over the wake with the kayak. When a little jet ski or john boat wake goes by, the whole kayak does this every single time the next wake comes. So the worst wakes for us are actually the little wakes, not the big wakes. When I see a barge come by, there's no fear. But people they automatically assume smaller vessel, because when you're in a boat and those big wakes come by, like you can go way up and way down. It's actually kind of fun in a kayak. There's no fear for me at all. Even when I was in my little kayak, there was no fear. So I wanted to dispel that myth just in case somebody was going to ask that. They're super stable nowadays. For you to flip this, you would have to be in the water and grab the other side and pull it over.
Yeah,
you can stand on this anywhere, and you're going to fall out before this thing flips.
I've had boats come by. That's the worst thing for me as a guy in a bass boat or a catfish boat or anything, they come by and they try to be nice. And the first thing they do is when they see you, they let off. Well, that whole boat sits back like that in the water and it creates this big old huge wake. And then they get right past you and then they go back down on it and create the same wake all over again. That is the worst wakes I've been in, and you can't even be mad at the guy because he tried to be nice to you.
Yeah, if you ever see us out there and you're opened up and playing, keep playing. You're doing us a favor by going fast. Like he said, when you slow down, those are the wakes that actually get choppy. The wakes that blow like the white caps over. If you see us, just keep going. And if a kayaker gets upset, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Because there are some kayakers like, why'd you go back by so fast? Well, they're morons. Don't listen to them. You know, they might give you the bird, whatever. If you're going by a kayaker, stay going as fast as you can, because that's the best wake that we can have, for sure. Anything else? You got any questions on any of it? Safety. We can go over some safety too, if you guys want. I'm sorry. How do you weight a fish? All right. So if you really want to take a weight, I do bring a scale when I think I might have a chance at a PB. But there's a lot of places I fish where there's very few chances to get a PB. It's just like a boat. I would take my net, I would grab my fish grips, and I do have a scale, I would just lift it up. But me being vertically challenged, sometimes the fish can be as long as I am. So I'm there trying to lift the fish up, even in the net. So I gotta like to lift the fish up over my head, and that can create a little turbulence. So, but that is really the only way to weigh the fish, to get more accurate measurement. There's another way to weigh fish, and it gives you a pretty accurate measurement. It's length times girth divided by 800 or something like that. Somebody has tested it. They put a YouTube video out. I believe it was Dan Shida, and he was comparing it against Green Machine Outdoors, for those who aren't aware of his name. He was comparing the formula to what fish actually weigh, and it was really dang close. So, yes, you know, with the formula, it might say 53 pounds, but that means you're in that 50 to 57 pound range. You know what I mean? It's a good formula. It's not precise. But if you are curious on what a fish weighs, go Google the formula for the length times girth times girth divided by whatever number it is. Because it is really accurate. It'll give you a great ballpark on what you just caught.
So I went out and I have the chubby fish grips. I think they weigh up to 20 pounds, correct me if I'm wrong.
40. Those weigh 40.
And I've got a set of 100-pound, they're Dr. Meter scales here. The Whisker Seeker scales, I bought a brand new set of those. They got wet one time, they were done. These have been in my kayak for 2 or 3 months, and my stuff sits outside. They still work. The batteries are dead, but they still work. I will not put scales or fish grips on a fish that's over 50 pounds. If you think it's even going to touch that mark, don't even worry about it. I mean, I got scales for YouTube. That's the only reason I have it. Everybody always wants to know what a fish weighs. That's the only reason I got these. I don't care what it weighs. It honestly doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that measuring board right on the front of that kayak right there. Because if it's 48 inches long, I'm beating Mike. That's all I care about.
I could touch on that too. So I run online catfishing tournaments. We do bank, boat, kayak, any kind of tournament that you want to hold, I can host it. And we do all of our events based on length, because there's no way, it's very hard to cheat length in a picture. And when you're online fishing against people across the country, it's impossible to get an entire fish in a picture so you can't weigh a 50-pound fish and take a selfie. You know what I mean? So the most accurate way we have to compete against each other is we just take length. The argument always comes up, no two 40-inch fish are the same. I've hosted well over 150 events. I've competed in well over 150 events. There may have been one event where the guy who took first didn't have the most weight. Maybe one. And that was when me and this guy tied, and I forgot my identifier for 2 weeks. That's a whole nother story.
We didn't tie. He made a rookie mistake and none of his fish counted for the first 2 weeks.
Yeah, I won the event, but there's this thing you have to have an identifier in the picture, because somebody would say, well, I can take a picture from 2 years ago and submit it to the leaderboard, but the unique identifier doesn't come out until the event starts. Well, I was in 4 events at the time, and I only had 3 of them written on my identifier card. So the first 2 weeks, all the fish I caught did not count towards the event that I would have finally beat him once.
And I didn't kick against this. I told him to count the fish, but he did not want to do it because he's an administrator of the tournament. I said, look, it's me and you up front. Nobody's even close. I said, count the fish. I would rather beat you knowing that I beat you fishing not by some rule technicality.
Yeah.
I mean,
We tied. He had the biggest second fish, so it was a bummer. No. Any more questions? No questions on safety? Safety is normally the big one that we get.
safety, I would start off on,
PFD, always, period.
people say, you fish the Ohio River in a kayak. Me and Mike was out and right around 4 mile an hour of current one day. We put in at Tanner's Creek. It's not far from here. It's right across Indiana side there. What was there? 6 of us launched out in the kayak tournament. We launched along the side of Vince McDowski's boat tournament there. 6 of us went out of the creek into the main river. 4 of them turned around and went right back in the creek. They said there's no way. I respect that decision. I mean, they made a judgment call on what their capabilities and their kayak could handle. Me and Mike went out and fished 4 mile an hour current all day. We were comfortable with that. Should we have been out there? Probably not. But I wasn't letting Mike beat me, and he wasn't letting me beat him, you know, so.
That brings a great point. Anchoring the kayak. I get anchoring in a kayak question a lot. You should never have your anchor point on the side. It's in current. You should never have your anchor point on the side. I have seen and almost flipped kayaks where I always anchor in one of the corners, and I anchor either into the current or away from the current. That way, either your nose is facing the current or the butt end is facing the current. If the current's too high, I will never anchor out the butt because the butt is the lowest part closest to the water. If you anchor and you put your rope behind, the water can very possibly start coming over the back of your kayak. It's actually, I believe Spencer Bauer said it happened to him, where he anchored and the current was so quick, it pulls the back of the boat into the water, and now you have the river coming through your boat instead of under your boat. So if you're anchoring in heavier current to me would be 2 miles an hour and faster. I would always suggest somehow anchoring it from the front. Some guys use trolleys. I don't use a trolley. I just wrap it around like my front rod holder. I do have cleats. Some guys use an anchor wizard. I tried that once, and the wizard just wasn't strong enough to get the anchor out. The wizard is really made for people who are lake fishing, where they can like get back over their anchor pretty easily. If you're in 3.5 mile an hour current on the Ohio River, especially if you don't have a trolling motor, you're never going to pull that anchor out with the wizard. The wizard will break right off your kayak before that anchor comes off the bottom. Because that anchor, by the time you stop, that is dug into the bottom, just like a boat. That thing is just dug right into the bottom. And there's been a few times I've had to snap the twist tie off of my never lost anchor because it was so stuck. And if I didn't have the motor, there's no way I would have been able to snap the twist tie. Because we don't generate enough force.
I run the anchor trolley. I feel like it gets my anchor rope to a point centered of the kayak more. I like to anchor most of the time with my front toward the current. That way, if there's logs coming down, I can see it. I'll throw my anchor out, and while it's still dropping to the bottom, I'm pulling this anchor trolley all the way up to the front just as far as I can get it. And that allows my kayak to sit in the current a lot straighter, which that one's kind of locked up. I've got it in a knot. But that allows my kayak to sit a lot straighter in the water. If you try to anchor this kayak in 2 or 3 mile an hour current, you had that anchor tied right here, you're going upside down.
Yeah.
Because it immediately rolls the kayak this way, water starts over the side. I've seen it 2 or 3 times. It's bad.
I honestly wouldn't advise anchoring over 2.5 unless you are very tenured in kayak catfishing.
So Mike's got a good question here. He says in heavy current, how does the trolling motor do pulling you back upstream? I don't like to launch and go downstream, period, ever. If I have to get back to the same launch point from where I started, I do not like to go downstream. If you get down there and something malfunctions, it's a long way to paddle back up 2 or 3 mile an hour current. We've done it. You're probably not doing it in this kayak. It's like being on a barge. So I always try to launch and go upriver and then fish my way back to where I'm at. I can get right around 5 to 5.2 miles an hour on a flat lake, no wind, no current. Whatever the current is, if you got a 2 mile an hour current, you knock 2 mile an hour off at top speed. It also runs your batteries dead a lot quicker. So generally, I try to keep my speed a notch or 2 above full speed, because once you go up so high, you're just wasting battery and not really gaining any speed. I'll try to keep it a notch or 2 below that just to regain and save some battery and effort on the trolling motor. Another way I combated that, I took a prop off of a smaller trolling motor that's made for a smaller boat, It's a 3-bladed prop. This trolling motor comes with a 2-blade. I put this on here and gained a mile an hour instantly. And I mean, all I did was take a wing nut off and put it on. I wish there was a company that made another prop for a kayak, because the props that come with these motors are made to pull a big, heavy boat. They're made to pull, what's a boat weight? 1,500, 2,000 pounds generally on an average boat. This kayak, all the way fully rigged out with me in it, probably don't weigh 600, 700 pounds, you know? So you can get a lot more speed out of the same motor and sacrifice some torque. You don't need all that takeoff power, you know, so you can sacrifice it. But nobody's making that, and I'm nowhere near smart enough to design a prop for a kayak. So until somebody does, it's just what it is.
And speaking of propulsion, there's 3 ways to propel a kayak. You got a motor option, you got a pedal option, which she has to drive for a pedal, and so do I, but we don't pedal since we have the motor. And you got your paddle option. Always, always, always have a backup propulsion system. So you see, he has a motor, I have a motor. I never have less than 1 paddle on me at all times, because if that battery dies or if your pedal system kicks out, you have to have a backup propulsion system. I'm pretty sure it's a law in some states that you have to have a paddle on board boats, I think. That trickles down into the kayak world too. No ODNR officer will ever give us a ticket because they think we're crazy enough to be out there in the kayak to begin with. But always, always, always have a paddle somewhere on your kayak. There's no worse feeling than having your motor kick out and just being at the mercy of the river. Unfortunately, just right here a few years back, that happened to a young man. He was out fishing when he probably shouldn't have been fishing on the Ohio River. He had no way to propel it or stop his kayak in the Ohio River. Mother Nature is undefeated, so always have a backup propulsion system. And if you fall out of a kayak, never fight the current. Just swim to the bank. Let the current push you down. Use your energy to get to the bank. Don't use your energy to swim against the current. It's just get to the bank, figure it out from there. Don't try and save any of your gear. I flipped the kayak. It was miserable. It was a week after the first cat con I ever went to, and I lost over $1,000 worth of gear. But, you know, that gear wasn't worth me dying in the river that day. So,
Just a few seconds left, and then last minute questions, and you guys want to wrap up your presentation.
I keep 2 backup forms of propulsion. The Hobie Mirage Drive. Basically, right now it's backup. That's what it is. That's $2,000 worth of take-up room in my kayak until I need it. I carry the half paddle just to save some room on my kayak. You could use this and get yourself to the shore. You're not going to use this and paddle anywhere fast. So if you lose the trolling motor and the pedal drive together, you can still use this, get yourself to shore, find some way to get dry and get home.
any last questions before we hop out of here? We're good? Thank you guys so much. This was a lot of fun.
We need to thank all our sponsors while we're up here. Steve Douglas, Monster Rod Holders, Chris Flores, Muddy River Catfishing, Never Lost Anchors. I think Chubby Fish is here. If you go to Chubby Fish and mention Ryan Bortz and tell him he was at my seminar, he has a free gift for you over there.
All right, give Ryan and Mike one more round of applause. Next seminar will be Chris Sauer at 2:15.
I'm gonna put one back here. They got those quick release brackets.
I hope I didn't burn
Let me
his
get this
material.
off.